Okay, great. I just want to make sure that my connection is fine. I'm really happy that CLS is having this talk because sometimes it feels like the West Indian Federation or ideas of this West Indian Federation has been consigned to the dustbin of history, or sometimes found in some obscure academic article in an obscure journal. But there can be no denial of the truth. That is, there has always been a dream that is the West Indian Federation. Now, Samuel Hurwitz, in a publication, The Federation of the West Indies, a study in nationalism, stated that there's a West Indian proverb, if you kill me, bury me too. The concept of a West Indian Federation, from his point of view, has been killed, but he said it refuses to be buried. And may Phoenix-like rise out of the ashes at some future date. And I think that is what I would like for us to discuss today. In this talk, I want to look at the various class interests that made the previous real attempt difficult. But I also want to look at the current context of the crisis of global capitalism, the failure of neoliberalism, and the existential threat of the climate crisis for us now to consider seriously the need for a West Indian Federation. I want to argue that with a reconstruction of the Caribbean political economy and a rethinking of the existing institutional structures, there is need for a renewed discussion about federation. I want to also argue that really with a strong conscious mass movement across the region and a ground-up approach to the federation, where the structures and policies are developed by ordinary people who understand that it is really through solidarity, not competition, unity, not insularity, social economy, not a market economy. That is what will bring the region closer to real freedom. Of course, the discussions about federation has itself a long history. I mean, as far back as 1860 in the appendix to a piece lectures on colonization and colonies by Herman Melville. Then you had private proposals that were made in 1876. Then in 1911, again, with lectures by Viscount Elibank, who had proposed a West Indian Council. But these proposals defined by the colonists and the emerging professional middle class, that is who it came from. And so the constitutional reform movement of the late 1800s really was led by the bourgeoisie, petty bourgeois class, and taken up by the professional middle class, who indeed had some ideas. And I would like to suggest that maybe it is these ideas that found itself in the Federation of 1957, which was different to Labor's vision and clarity for federation. I want to really argue that the vision of Labor for the federation was different to what really would become that federation of the 50s and 60s, which was, in fact, led and played more into the hands of certain class interests. And I would come back to that a little bit when we make the case for federation today. Now, C.L.R. James, in echoing the ideas of federation in the context of self-government or independence, in his essay on a case for West Indian self-government, talked about the making of the Caribbean people and the birth of a nation, of a new nation. And that this birth was the most exciting and unusual development in the modern world. I want to agree with him and to say that it is still the most exciting and unusual development in the modern world today. For sure, building a nation, and in this case, a Caribbean nation, is complex. There's no doubt about it. And Eric Duke had traced the history of the idea of federation by what he calls divergent, differentiated, and conflicting interests, with their ebbs and flows eventually culminating in a federation, which lasted from 1958 until 1962. But like C.L.R. James, I shall use the more well-established philosophical basis of Hegel, Marx, and Engels, that the beginning is in the end, and the end is in the beginning. So the end of the 1957-1962 federation is in fact a new beginning, just as the Haitian Revolution, which ended slavery in Saint Dominique, was the beginning of the Caribbean nation. Some are of the view, like Duke, for example, that the agendas of the West Indian nation building actually became part of a sort of Black globalized challenge to white domination. And he had argued that the participation of the West Indian middle class shifted the meaning of a united West Indies from sort of colonial envisioning of a united status quo, meaning administrative efficiency and greater economic productivity. And that this agenda, he argued, was co-opted by Afro-Caribbean reformers, middle class, and converted it into demands of self-government and self-determination. But notwithstanding, sisters and brothers, comrades, let us be clear. In the aftermath of World War I, it was the mass movement and organized labor that did in fact play a crucial role in confronting British colonialism. And they insisted on self-government and federation. These demands and dreams showed an increasing solidarity amongst the mass organizations within the region. Captain Cipriani, one of the leading labor leaders who emerged after the general strike of 1919 in Trinidad and Tobago, had brought a resolution for federation at the first labor conference held in 1926. This resolution would return, now that is 1926, that resolution would return in 1932 in a labor conference held in Dominica. And an even more precise resolution was passed in the British Guiana Caribbean Conference, which was held in 1938 in the aftermath of the 1937 rebellion. Now, this 1937 rebellion, led by workers, led by ordinary working people, and it was across the region, one of the key political demands of the working class, of the mass movement within the region and across the region, was indeed federation in the rather self-determination or self-government or independence in the context of federation. That was a critical political demand by the mass movement, by ordinary working people across the Caribbean, from Guyana to Trinidad to Barbados, Jamaica, St. Lucia, Grenada, St. Vincent, I can go on. Building, of course, this Caribbean or West Indian nation, I will use the term interchangeably, also came out of this kind of post-World War II sort of concession by Britain to grant some form of self-rule to the West Indian colonies under some kind of federal system. Now, once federation and self-rule was conceded by Britain, conflicting class interests began to develop between, you had the radical activists on one hand, and then you had the West Indian middle class reformers on the other. Unfortunately, the latter ultimately prevailed in terms of the organization of forms of governance that really came to be the hallmark of West Indian nationalism, which lead us to why the first formal attempt failed. And of course, there are many reasons we can come up with, right? Some argue that that experiment failed because we were still colonies, that federalism was forced on West Indians by an imperia because the region was no longer profitable dependencies. Some argue that. Norman Manley said in the Jamaican House of Representatives in 1955 that it was the British government which is keeping the federal parliament in a lower status. And when asked in 1958 why the federation was not independent, he said, perhaps the timidity of West Indians. Now remember, we're still talking about the sort of middle classness emerging. There were even those who argued, when you consider the referendum that would have been eventually passed. And of course, we could get into that discussion, but I just want to make a sort of passing statement on that Bustamante had appealed to this idea of isolationism and self-interest, and that there had been this contention that Jamaica's choice was between independence and subservience, that the referendum involved a vote for or against the Manley government, whole record. And we see that sort of party politicking coming inside of the mix, and that the issue from those who were contesting against it was in reality between rich and poor, and that the new brown ruling class favored an expensive federal system which would further impoverish the others. Now, of course, the aftermath of that referendum would have been great confusion. And the position of Trinidad and Tobago was an interesting one, because the fact that the Trinidad opposition, which was led and dominated by East Indians, so now we see the issue of race playing an issue coming into the mix, which continued after the referendum. They continued to advocate for the federation, which probably increased Dr. Williams' agitation and therefore his antagonism to it. But I want to suggest that that is a reflection of that professional middle class. And in fact, he refused to allow it to become an election issue in 1961 elections. He threatened to retire. And of course, he would make his famous statement. I think it's probably one of the most famous statements. Whenever there's a discussion of federation, it's like the one thing everybody remembers. 10 from North leaves, or rather, sorry, yeah, it was 1 from 10. 1 from 10 leaves North. And then with the elections in Trinidad in 1961, what you really found was the politics of race becoming entrenched in Trinidad and Tobago society. The Eastern Caribbean, it left them in a bit of a lurch and some confusion, but they sort of try to keep that idea alive with the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. And of course, there can be a long list of reasons why it failed, but I like to use CLR James in his understanding of the failure of that experiment. When he was secretary of the West Indian Federal Labour Party, he said this. He said, devoid of program and consideration for the people, local politicians, they saw federation and met amongst themselves, only to arrange what their governments would get and what they would lose. This is always an important part of any political discussion, but if you are discussing nothing else, then the result is always violent quarrels. In fact, the unseemly squabbles for that is what they were, by which these gentlemen broke up the federation and disgraced West Indian people. That was CLR statement. I guess in the end, the economic interests of the bourgeoisie in the more powerful islands really triumph over the ideal of West Indian unity. And it's something that we need to pay attention to as we discuss this new possibility in this new context. You see, the generation of the 1937-38 rebellion was not the generation of 1957-62. The new generation of the professional middle class they came to dominate political, economic, and intellectual landscape. So even if they studied in England to, yes, be critical of the empire, but at the same time, they were schooled in bourgeois politics and economics. And that, I believe, was at the heart of the demise of the Federation. But then, so let us now look at the global political economy and its reality for the Caribbean. What are we dealing with now? Well, while 240 million people are going to fall into extreme poverty at the same time and face dire hunger, at the same time, in the same world that we exist in, billionaires' wealth increased by 42%. That is more than over the previous 23 years. So now the 10 richest men in the world own more than 40% of all humanity. The 20 richest people have more wealth than the entire gross domestic product of all the countries of the Caribbean put together. The billionaire dynasty controls also agribusiness that dominates so much of our global food system, including Caribbean food security. And they are growing in strength. Their collective wealth increased by $382 billion in the last 2 years. And then you have big oil, BP, Shell, Total Energies, Exxon, and Chevron. They made a combined profit whilst people suffered in the pandemic, lost their jobs, and so on. They made $82 billion in profit in 2021. And they paid out $51 billion in dividends. And you will see why this is relevant, because when we look at Guyana and Suriname now, what is in fact is happening is Exxon is attempting to control Caribbean oil. Now, I mention these things because, you see, we cannot for one moment ignore that the power associated with such great wealth influence current governments, especially governments in the Caribbean, who then have to develop fiscal policies that are in favor of the rich and large corporations, right? We all know that the Caribbean region does play an important role in the process of global accumulation, and we are paying a high price for this. With the expansion of neoliberal logic and the imposition of these free trade agreements, the latest being the European Partnership Agreement negotiated between the EU and African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries. Our countries, where we find ourselves already in a violent process at the periphery, the dependence of our economy now within those arrangements has made us even more vulnerable to the capitalist crisis, which occurred in 2007, 2008, and again in 2018, and will continue and continue. Then you have the COVID-19 crisis, also dramatically worsened the situation of the exploited classes within the region. Massive retrenchments, drastic reduction in real wages, dematerialization of work, destruction of trade unions, commodification of common goods and life, accelerated privatization of the public sector. Would we not have, to me, a better chance in dealing with this aggressive and violent nature of neoliberalism, capitalism, and imperialism as one federal community? Even if we were to talk about climate justice, and how are we to avoid that what in fact is coming is green colonialism, where all the technology and jobs are owned by the same large corporation, right back to where we start. As a federation, I believe we have a better chance at changing the mode of production, the capitalist mode of production. Now, to do so, I want to go back to the original idea as specifically articulated by labor, as it was labor that really was pushing for federation in a real sense. So let's take, for example, the summary of the resolution passed by the British Guiana West Indian Labour Congress in November 1938. It said, federation, number one, that was number one, eh? That was number one at that conference, federation. And number two, constitutional reform. And the conference called upon the Royal Commission to recommend that the granting of self-government with adult suffrage to the several West Indian colonies. And that was from labor. Later in 1945, with the establishment of the Caribbean Labour Congress, and at the September 1945 Congress, Richard Hart of Jamaica, he made a profound statement. And here's what he said in that conference. And then you're talking about 1945. He said, this conference cannot too strongly urge that the development of the Caribbean area as one economic entity is the only way of creating a stable and self-supporting economy. This is possible only if such a program of development and expansion is conceived and directed under the unified control obtainable under a federal constitution with responsible government. Now, yes, granted, there were some gaps in the CLS and the Caribbean Labour Congress resolution on issues like finance and trade, customs union, and so on. But it was focusing on political structure. And I could understand why, because at that time, we weren't independent nation states. So I could understand why that would be. Now, the future of the West Indies involved the ways and means to federation of the whole Caribbean area. And what do I mean by that? In the Washington Post in 1973, CLR James had argued that what is required is a federation, not a federation of British-speaking islands. And this is where I think it gets very interesting. He says it has to be, or it should include, such a federation, should include Haiti, Dominican Republic, Cuba, Guadeloupe, Martinique, Aruba, and Suriname. So that is something for us to think about. Now, what should be the elements of this federation? And I want to start actually with defense. As it stands, militarily, in all, we are under the purview of something called the Southern Command, or SOUTHCOM of the US. Now, SOUTHCOM is responsible for Central America, South America, and of course, guess where? The Caribbean. And it is interesting to note that in the Caribbean, there are some 29 US NATO military bases. And recently, and when I talk about recently, I mean as recent as May, from the 7th to the 21st, they conducted some exercise called the Trade Win-Wins 2022. And they, have these, the Americans always like to coin things. So they call it TW22, which include actually a joint and kind of combined training focus on increasing regional cooperation, complex, according to them, multinational security operations, but that is led, planned, and operated by the US. And this is an issue that has to be addressed as a federation and cannot be addressed as individual nation states. Even in this sort of arrangement under a CARICOM, it needs something much more strong and clear. Now, turning to the economy, there is definitely need for a new Caribbean political economy. Now, one of the problems with the Arthur Lewis model of industrialization by invitation, which was really the dominant economic model from 48 to 68, and therefore you would have seen that the early attempt, the 1957, 62, or 58, 62 federation fell in that time frame, was really nothing more than a rapid introduction of industrial capitalism into the Caribbean. I mean, there was, we have all, and I agree with that analysis, that the plantation system was a form of capitalism. I agree. But what Arthur Lewis sought to do was to really, in an aggressive way, introduce industrial capitalism in the Caribbean. I also do want to agree with Beckford's analysis that the plantation economy is an extension of the metropolitan capitalist economy, as well as the analysis of Bess and Levitt, who define the plantation economy as the domination of a hinterland by transnational cooperation of the countries at the center of world capitalism. And then going further, Norman Girvan, here's a comparative analysis of the differentiation between colonies of settlement and colonies of exploitation and conquest. That meant that the economic and class system of Marx's classical capitalism, that is reproduced in the Caribbean. So much so that even the formation of non-white bourgeoisie does not mean that there is any fundamental break of the status quo or even a threat to the ruling elites. It is merely an adaptation which further entrenches within our region capitalist mode of production. I think that sometimes it's necessary. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in '89, the Caribbean left went into a bit of, I guess, reflective retreat, for want of a better expression. But I do think it is need for us to dust off works like the one by Clive Thomas, his piece on dependence and transformation, the economics of the transition to socialism. I think that is an interesting piece that need to be reviewed in the context, of course, of the neoliberal agenda today, which to me raises a fundamental question, right? How do we organize the mode of production? And really a critical question for us now is, who owns the means of production? These are questions that must be confronted, not addressed, but confronted. Now, when you read the latest policy documents coming out of CARICOM, and I think there was one that came out, maybe I remember at the last conference of the economy last year, they presented some economic policy. But really what that is, it is really nothing more than a policy that is governed by the plantation system and bourgeois economics of neoliberalism. There was nothing that speaks to the creative expansion in economic life of ordinary working Caribbean people. So we really need to develop a system of ownership, control, production, and distribution, which is focused not on meeting the needs of shareholders, but really focus on meeting the needs of the people. So we need fundamental changes in the political and social systems. We need to talk about the democratization of power in the workplace, strong trade union confederation across a federation with workers' cooperatives being at the center of production. Federalization, or I guess nationalization, or I would say federalization, because we're talking federation, of key sectors, telecommunications. That is completely now in the hands of multinational corporations, finance, same. Industries like steel, oil, and gas. And even as Guyana really ramping up their oil and gas production, let us not fool ourselves. That is driven by foreign capital. That is Exxon, okay? And when we talk about renewables, again, I mentioned it before, it's something we have to guard against. This thing of green colonialism, that in our attempts to shift towards a green economy, I think that's what they call it now, a green economy. But what does that mean in terms of the reproduction of daily life for ordinary working people? I would like to suggest too that of what federation would have to address, a major aspect, is this issue of public ownership, especially when you think of it in terms of the climate crisis, which is an existential threat for the region. In other words, how do we have a more just transition to a public low carbon future for the West Indies? Not a private, because that's where they're heading, and they couch it. So what they're doing, in fact, right now, is structural adjustment in the region under the guise of a so-called just transition. I believe that in order for us to fulfill the right to energy, that can only be done in the context of a federation, recognizing access to energy as a human right and a basic need, and ensuring that there's provision of electricity on a public goods basis, not on a market basis. And I'm saying this because, comrades, brothers and sisters, this is a real thing that is happening right now as we speak in terms of Trinidad and Tobago. Liberalize completely the fuel market, removal of subsidies completely, market-driven prices for electricity and water, etc. So the federation will have to allocate and publicly fund energy transition and not pin it on the private sector or pin it on multinational corporations. So we can establish what you could call a regional public goods framework. Because if we don't do that, we would have many of our, not just industries, but sectors, things that are important, what we call the life support infrastructure, can shift completely into the hands of private capital. Now, I'm not saying that these things cannot be done under CARICOM, but we all know the limitations of CARICOM. But I also want to say that it'll be more practical under a West Indian Federation, that the current structures and institutions right now are already too rooted in neoliberalism. But the making of a nation is, of course, not by any means limited to the economic basis. Either some people talk about an advanced basis, all right? So that the nation is recognized or is formed in terms of qualities that are interfused in many respects, apart from the economic structure. So freedom of movement, there has to be a focus on freedom of movement, because right now there's a focus on freedom of movement of capital, not labor. Transportation, you know, when they had the West Indian Federation, you know, there was something called RSS. I'm not sure anybody remember that. Regional shipping system for the region, by the region, organized by the region. All right. Now, of course, they've shifted from the RSS is no longer a regional shipping system. It's now a regional security system. And guess who operated, planned, designed, organized by guess who? Yes, the Americans. So we also have to address the issue of language. There's no West Indian language, okay? But we can be a multilingual society. That is not impossible. It exists in Africa. It exists amongst indigenous people. Even as the formal language represents European languages, there's no reason why we cannot be a multilingual region. In fact, I would even like to go further and say that Creole should be something that is taught within the schools across the region. All right. We have excelled. I think there can be no doubt in areas of sports, the arts, and the creative sector. And I believe that it is in those areas we can find greater possibilities than even just tourism. Okay. Now, as I conclude this talk, because I try to pack a lot in a short space of time. I'm not Usain Bolt, who can run 100 meters in less than 10 seconds. I can't do that. But I tried my best, right? So as I conclude this talk, I have to speak of the mass movement as the vehicle for change. The idea is that throughout the political history of the Caribbean, it has always been the mass movement that brought about fundamental change. Therefore, it has to be a strong, united mass movement across all the language, geographic, and cultural barriers that I believe can lay the foundation for what we could call a new West Indian Federation. You see, the mass movement represents the heartbeat of a people. It's movement, which is itself a process of movement, moving society from one social category to another. And it has been the vehicle that gave life to the cries of Black power and power to the people. It was the mass movement that gave life to that, okay? Now, I believe that the seed is there in one particular formation, that is the Assembly of Caribbean People. You see, the Assembly is the brainchild of John LaRose, another great thinker, who, interestingly, was a founding member of the left-wing West Indian Independence Party. I deliberately said it that way, because that was the kind of vision that people like John LaRose and George Laming and so on, CLR James, this idea of this West Indianness. And so they had the West Indian Independence Party of the early 50s. And that this formation, the Assembly of Caribbean People, is being driven by my friend and comrade David Abdullah. Now, this pan-regional platform of civil society and mass organizations, such as trade unions, includes countries like Cuba, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Martinique, Guadeloupe. You see, when we talk in West Indian Federation, I want us never to forget those countries, those peoples that are still colonized. Puerto Rico, Martinique, Guadeloupe, British Virgin Islands, US Virgin Islands. I mean, we are still one of the most colonized regions in the world. And that is something that we also have to confront, not address, confront. Now, in its declaration, in its final declaration, coming out of the last assembly held in Trinidad and Tobago, here is what it stated. It stated that the Caribbean people stand resolute in defense of our sovereignty, our independence and identity, and in the struggle for a better life for all. We reject neoliberalism in all its forms and manifestation. We oppose the imperialist agenda that seeks to subjugate our region and our people. We say that every Caribbean country that is colonized is an anachronism 215 years after the Haitian Revolution won independence. I believe this platform can provide the ideological and organizational scaffolding to build a new West Indian Federation. I am not sure that the current Caribbean Labour Congress, in its current form, and in the absence of a clear ideological grounding, can do that. The new society stands really in need of a more permanent idea that relates to the continuing experience of ordinary people. That means a socialist ideology that act like, according to Lennox Pear, another great left thinker, a white line in the road to give the mass movement and organized labor a guide for planned organization of social equality. If That ideology based on class consciousness of the masses and labor solidarity, and in keeping with the namesake of your organization, and I guess that it was the vision of Richard Hart, Caribbean labor solidarity and labor solidarity. If that don't emerge, then the West Indian society, the existential threat that Norman Govan often warned us about, will become real. But the enthusiasm to see that different type of future just may bring the dream of a West Indian Federation more rapidly to reality. Let me just, as I started, quickly share one last video in keeping with the sort of spirit, because I think it's important that we have that, it's just part of our how to put it, of who we are as a people. It's deeply embedded in our culture and in our sense of identity. So I'm just going to share this. It's very short, quick, short song that came out of the Assembly of Caribbean People.
Now, one Caribbean people, one bright, one destiny, are coming together, hands across the water, one flag on the island, everybody come on now, one spirit, one love, one destiny, yeah. And cross the water, children, and cross the water, children, and cross the water, children, and cross the water, children. Yeah. Oh. One Caribbean people, hands across the water now, hands across the sea, one flag on the island, oh, one destiny, one love, one heart, one soul, one spirit, one destiny, yeah. I said we're coming together, we're coming together, we're coming together now. Hands across the water, children, hands across the water, children. Hear the trumpet call, hear the trumpet call. We're breaking down the walls, just like the walls of Jericho. Listen to the trumpet call. Oh yeah. Everybody sing. One Caribbean people. One Caribbean people, yeah. One heart. One destiny, yeah. One Caribbean people. One Caribbean soul. Oh, one heart, one destiny. And come together now. Come together now. Come together now. Come together now. Come together now.
So, as I close, I just want to say, in the spirit of CLR James, Uriah Butler, Richard Hart, George Lamming, that what can the Federation, in terms of what the whole of the Caribbean could be when the people are in charge of their own reality? To me, that is at the center, being in charge of our path. And therefore, I'm arguing this afternoon that a federation would be the only means by which the Caribbean people, West Indians, can be in charge of our own destiny. Thank you, comrades. Thank you, sisters and brothers.
Thank you so much, Ozzy, and I'm sure people will join by showing a clap and showing an appreciation for that very illuminating talk. I've made so many notes just going through it, but I think I begin where you ended, because in some ways, looking at the edutainment as we tend to look at it, and the culture of the Caribbean, and how much we have to offer in terms of what we've done in a very short space of time around music and creativity. And it's clear that coming from the region, we've got so much potential, so much talent, so much stuff that we can actually transform our societies. And one of the big challenges for me is the brain drain that continually goes on with the Caribbean, with young people feeling they have no future within the Caribbean region and having to leave the region to being able to make a living and to live some kind of a life. And if we could keep that potential in the Caribbean, and also with the whole idea of federation, that we all join together to try to solve the problems and difficulties that we will have to address, with the global warming and the pandemics, and these are the challenges that will come forward. And you clearly located, a lot of the issues around how neoliberalism and imperialism will affect us. And I think increasingly in a polarized world that we have it, that the US is not afraid to say openly, if you're not with us, you're against us. We will find, ourselves in the so-called backyard, at the forefront of a lot of the struggles that are coming. And unless we are kind of united and strong together, we will certainly feel a lot of pressure. I'll remind people that there's an OAS meeting tomorrow, I think in California, somewhere in the US, and the Americans are looking to exclude the radicals from the region. They've excluded Cuba, they've excluded Nicaragua, they've excluded Venezuela. And I think the position of CARICOM was that if they're not included, they will boycott this conference that's coming up. Now, the Americans are trying to stay firm on it, trying to say, they're holding the conference in their country, they can invite who they want. But I think it's for the Caribbean people to stay united. We know divide and rule has always been the strengths of the Europeans in the Caribbean in many ways. It's not beyond them to point out and threaten us with us being Haitianized if we don't go along with their program of economic development. I think Hilary Beckles has pointed out in his recent book the way in which the British were very duplicitous, really, in the way they dealt with the whole issue of federation, saying one thing and doing something else behind the backs of people and so on. And especially as regards the demand for the resources so that we could actually do a proper development. They were determined that we would not get the money that was needed. I think Arthur Lewis has exposed a lot of that. Hillary is in his book as well, the way in which they deliberately said they will give you aid, but not money for development. And it's almost, something that we've actually got to come to terms with as a region, this almost hatred of African and African heritage, that they will punish you for daring to break away from this system. And I think the Caribbean has certainly suffered a lot as a result of daring to say, we will not go along with your economic model, or we want to have independence, we want to do something different from you. And they continue to come down very heavy on any country that actually, little Grenada, how can Grenada be a threat to the Americans? It's about ideas, it's about the ideas we have. Cuba is a continual threat to them because of the different lifestyle and ideas that they've had, the different role of development. And we hear a lot about sovereignty, but when America is ready, it respects no one's sovereignty. And we in the Caribbean, especially, are at risk or at a threat. So I'd like to think about those things. I mean, federation for me is such a organic thing, it started not, you gave a lot of the history of it there just now, but even in the 17th century, I think the colonies and the settlers understood, when the buccaneers and the pirates were targeting or ripping them up, they tried to form some kind of unity to say we will protect each other. And we have to, in that same spirit now, see that we're going to be confronted with some real pressures coming down in the next period. And it's only by joining together a federation that holds us together that we can resist. So I share with you those sentiments that you've put there. The question I would put to you maybe is for you to maybe elaborate a little bit more on is, how do you see that operating within the Caribbean? You touched on it a little bit, but I'm thinking, how do you form a chapter in Barbados? You've got something going in Trinidad already, and that's really fantastic, but I'm not aware that there's any of the other islands or any other countries in the region are actually making federation of this. And so how do you see those organizations maybe forming, taking part, and not from a top-down level, but from the bottom up? How do you get the people together? What are the challenges there?
Yeah, I mean, that is it's a real challenge, and it is difficult. Now, one of the things I noticed back in the 50s and so on, leading up to the Federation, is that you had things like the West Indian Federal Labour Party, you had the West Indian Independence Party. There was this kind of cross geographic lines, in other words, shared ideological positions. And I believe if we want to go from the ground up, we have to use, as I call it, the scaffolding, which is like the assemblies of Caribbean people, because that is an opportunity whereby civil society and the mass organizations are rallying around a concept of one Caribbeanness. But that if I'm, for example, if I'm in Jamaica or I'm in Barbados, I know that there are comrades in Cuba, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico. I understand the concerns of hate of Martinique and the other, they like to call them dependencies, if you may. But one of the main challenge to that is going to be the dominant bourgeois political ideology. That is going to be because you see, even as those things start to take root, Comrade Luke, they will do everything in their powers to smash it, because that's what they did in the 50s. All right. Because they understand very clearly what will be the threat to them. And that is the real threat to them. I believe that really focusing on class consciousness and class solidarity on the ground, building and talking more about federation. Now, the other advantage we have is how do we use technologies, really? I mean, unlike in the 50s and 60s, where I have to wait for maybe a newspapers or a letter to come on a ship, a click on a mouse, I know what's happening in Barbados. I know what's happening in Grenada. I know what's happening in St. Lucia. People share. So what could be happening, and it's something that we need to tap into, is this networking of Caribbean people, which, by the way, is including the West Indian diaspora. Who have an auntie and an uncle and a cousin in Barbados, in Jamaica, in Grenada, and so on. Another area to tap into is within the question of the cultural realm. If you go, I'll just give you an example. You go to one of those fetes in New York, Miami, or wherever, you know who you're seeing there? You're seeing Antiguan, Kittian, Grenadian, Vincentian, etc. And I could make the list. You could find the whole federation right there in that space. So it's how do we connect these spaces now to a political project? And I think that is crucial and will be important for organized labor to build national mass movements that are grounded in the idea of Caribbeanness. So it's not a Trinidad mass movement or a Jamaica mass movement or a Barbados mass movement. It's a West Indian mass movement, because, we find ourselves really, another simple example. If in New York, I go by my auntie, she's actually actually Vincentian. My aunt is actually Vincentian. I go by auntie, and she called across some friends. In that little space, her friends from Barbados, Grenada, St. Kitts. So we find in social spaces, that federation in life. But when it comes to the political and economic project, there is a disconnect. And I'm suggesting that disconnect is deliberate. And once we understand that disconnect is deliberate, how can we now connect those social spaces and those cultural spaces with the political and economic project?
Yes, thanks for that. I agree with you in many ways, but also I felt that the other issue that comes up very strongly for us in the Caribbean is looking at the reparations for slavery, native genocide.
Oh, yes.
And some people are trying to, think about and include also for indentureship and also for yes. So, I think linking all of those things, we will need money for any kind of a federation. And one of the ways in which the British actually strangled the whole idea of federation was starving it of resources and money. I think there's opportunity for us to also make the issue of reparations something that how do we get, we will need to get some money sometime. I think the pressure is growing and we got to keep that pressure up. But also for it to succeed, we need to work at that grassroots level again. Reparations, I think we will struggle to get reparations unless we include the masses. They need to understand what it's all about. They get to learn about their history. We get to open up all these ways in which they can see that the exploitation that our ancestors went through, is linked to the conditions we are in today. And that is only by fighting and struggling and resisting and fighting for reparations that we will be able to get the resources that we need to do a proper federation. Of course, one of the challenges I think we've got is before the whole idea of federation was before there was independence for many of the countries. People have been independent for a little while now, some 50, 60 years, become nationalistic. I'm Jamaican and I'm, Barbadian or Guyanese, whatever. And I think there's some of that, and there might be a reluctance from some areas to say, well, okay, we will federate and be as one. Whatever that will look like might be a different name, this federation that we're talking about. Some people might think, the idea of a federation is past and we need to find a new language or a new something to deal with it. And these are some of the discussions which I hope, people will join us in a little while. I won't be putting more to you, but after you've had your chance at this, replying to what I've just said, we can start to look at any questions. People might want to raise their hands or just put a question in the chat. So yes, how do you see the linking of the whole reparations movement and federation?
I think that is actually very important. And maybe therein lies the financing, because you are correct. Financing in the region from outside has always been in the form of aid. That's a real challenge. In fact, if you speak to some CARICOM officials, they'll tell you that majority of the funding that comes into CARICOM is aid funding. And we all know the conditionalities that come with aid funding. And therefore, the reparation question is a crucial question. One of those who argue against it often like to put forward this argument, well, if we get reparations, who the money will go to? I mean, who the money will go to? I don't think we are short of any intelligent West Indian who can put in place a mechanism by which this funds can be channeled to finance our development. I mean, we have enough capacity and capability. So I think that the reparation question has to go hand in hand, because then that addresses the finance issue. All right. And I do agree too with the idea of combining with the question of reparations in terms of indentureship, so that what we don't have in our thrust going forward, a race division within that attempt, because that is very easy for imperialist powers and for the bourgeoisie, because the bourgeoisie they just love to keep the proletariat divided. They would do anything to divide the mass movement. And if they can divide it along race lines, they will do so. So that is something that I think we can look at. And I think the question of reparation is a just one. It is a just one. I mean, you cannot really even quantify. You can't even quantify the violence, the raw violence meted out to generations of people. Okay, so reparations is a just and a just call. And I believe if we can break with the plantation economy, if we can reorganize who owns the means of production, I believe that reparation financing can go to where it needs to go, which is to expand the economic life of ordinary West Indians. Because ordinary West Indians are extremely creative. When we think of the things we excel in, sports, it's a working class sports men and women, coming from working class families. When you think of the arts, working class persons, the people who invented pan were not people of the upper echelons of society. It came from the ground. It came from ordinary people. All right. And even when you think of the mass and the carnival and all of that, they of course, the bourgeoisie will try to co-opt it. But where did these things originate? They originated in the minds, hearts and souls of ordinary West Indians. And therefore, I believe that channeled properly with a reorganizing, a dismantling of the plantation economy, reorganizing who owns the means of production, will give us an opportunity to define our own economic path.
Yes. Okay, thanks. I think I'll put one final question to you, because it just struck me that one of the big issues in the region is food. I mean, it's ridiculous that I think the last I saw of it is we in the Caribbean import something like 5 billion in food every year. I mean, in a region that is not short of sunshine and rain. Of course, there's been some droughts and so on sometimes, but you would think that the Caribbean would be more than food sufficient. And because the experience of Venezuela, and maybe I should just share a little bit of news about Venezuela, because one of our comrades, I don't know if he's in the audience, Dr. Francisco, he has just written a piece about Venezuela and looked at the way Venezuela suddenly has turned its economy completely around, despite the heavy sanctions there under some 250 some measures taken against Venezuela. They have now got the inflation down to single digits. There's predicted growth of 6% or something, so they're doing very well. They were one of the biggest food importers in the region, and because of these sanctions and because of the pressures they were under, they've had to make adjustment. And now there's something like, I think, 80% food sufficient, so they don't have to depend on food coming from outside. And I think it's something, we should be moving towards, more in the 90% of supplying our own food in the region. I don't know if you had any thoughts on food sufficiency and the problems of not being able to feed our own people in the region.
Yeah, and I think that is, because I did mention this question of energy security, but I want to even suggest that going beyond food security, what we need is food sovereignty, all right? Because you can have food security, when your food is completely dominated by agribusiness, multinational agribusiness. And that is not where we want to go. What we want is food sovereignty. Building any society that society has to be able to feed itself. Because if you can't feed yourself, here's what could happen, right? Is exactly what they attempted with Venezuela. It means that the imperialists will always be able, whenever you decide, whenever your people decide to choose a different path to what they want for you, they will starve you. They will. And when you have or depend on importation to the level that we have, like in Trinidad and Tobago, you know what's the food import bill in Trinidad and Tobago? $5 billion a year. Now, they talk about the subsidies, right? But they don't talk about the food import bill. So I do agree with you that one of the pillars, let's call it a pillar, that we need to focus on would be food sovereignty. I agree with that, because that can be weaponized. Food security, as defined in the limitation of security, can be weaponized against any people who choose a path that is different to the imperialist agenda. So food sovereignty has to be one of those key pillars. I agree with you. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay, thanks for that. Now we'll open up the floor for questions. People can raise their hands in the chat or put the questions in the chat. So any questions you want to put to Ozzi. Can anybody tell me, is there any questions out there?
Can I say there's Raphael Andrews and Kwaku BBM?
Okay, should we go in that?
Indicated.
Okay, they want to put it in the chat or they want to speak? Can we put them in that order then? Raphael, can you come in?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, good. I managed to unmute. I was talking, but nobody could hear me. Some of what I was going to raise has been covered, but not all of it. So I'll just say that the question of federation is kind of a two-pronged question, and it's a question which is basically what is to be gained and what people will be negative towards it, and saying what is to be lost. And you've actually hinted on it by pointing out the isolationism and also the competition between various islands. But the point of this is, and the fundamental point is I want to make, is that combined together in the Caribbean, there's a population of 23 million, as opposed to islands not competing against each other. If we were to combine and work together, we'd have a combined population of 20 million. In terms of resources, we've got oil, we've got agricultural products as well. There's 3 countries, Venezuela, Grenada, and Trinidad. They have oil. So we're actually in a very powerful position. But if we combine, that's the point. The second point is that in terms of the much more negative aspects against it, is that people are going to look at in terms of the kind of thing, especially the US, the fact there's this 2 huge military bases, one in Jamaica and the other one, of course, in Cuba, in Guantanamo Bay. So what I'm asking the question is, what is the best way we can proceed to sell the idea of federation to the Caribbean, especially the Caribbean people, given that there's going to be a somewhat negative response towards it, especially about a lot of Caribbean islands? And what do you think would be the best way forward in trying to advance and showing them that they have interest in their own benefit, that they can advance together rather than separately?
Thanks, Raphael. And there's another question. You want to take another question? Ozzy, listen to the next speaker and then answer the 2. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. And
right. Okay. This is Kwaku. First of all, I want to thank the speaker. Fantastic. Secondly, I want to thank the organizers, because at the last meeting, and unbeknown to me, you had arranged to speak on the West Indian Federation. And I had said that until then, all I knew really was that the British government was a supporter of the Federation. And you said, well, there was another side to it. So I'm glad that the speaker is sort of giving us, I'll say, a Caribbean perspective of the Federation. The other thing I knew about the Federation was what came out of Claudia Jones, because I do a lot of things around Claudia Jones. And indeed, the first publication of the West Indian Gazette, it did say last year, March, Ghana became independent. And I know there's at least one Ghanaian woman in the room. And this year, March 1958, she's looking to the independence of a country. So she saw the Federation as a country. That's how she sort of described. And subsequently, through the West Indian Gazette, being the supporter of the Federation, there was a lot of articles on it. Can I just take a moment to plug? I've put in the chat that we're doing something on Claudia Jones and Marcus Garvey next Saturday. It's in the chat. So 2 questions for you, Ozzy. First of all, the West Indian Federation just had the 10 islands, and you mentioned Guyana. Guyana wasn't one of it, neither was British Honduras, Belize. So I'd be interested to know why it didn't happen. Secondly, look, you're always saying that what the British did are not supporting the Federation, but there's another narrative that it imploded, i.e. from inwards, because of countries like Jamaica trying to go independent and trying to look for their independence. So I'm very much interested in Ozzy, maybe giving a narrative that may counter or may support the narrative that the Caribbean, particularly Jamaica, was part of the process of the collapse of the West Indies. But lastly, this is it. In 1940 and onwards, the British government actually funded the West Indian Development Fund. There was a West Indies Development and Welfare Organization. There was a fund. So Ozzy, can you speak to that money? The Moy Commission suggested at least 20 million pounds was needed to develop the Caribbean. You know, it went there in 1938. It was in a dire state. It had not changed since 100 years prior to the so-called abolition of the enslavement. So what did this organization or the fund do to develop the Caribbean? I'm quite interested to hear about that. Thank you very much.
If I can just quickly, Kwaku, in response to some of the questions around the finance and the British role, I think it'd be too much to go into now, but I would really suggest if people can get Hilary Beckles' book. He's actually, it's well recorded the way in which the British were saying one thing and doing something else, and they were definitely not prepared to fund a Caribbean development. They were prepared to give aid and make sure that we were starved of money so that you don't really able to plan any kind of development program. And I think this was one of the things that Arthur Lewis pointed out. But I would suggest, it's well recorded in Hilary Beckles' book. Okay, Ozzy, over to you. Thanks.
All right. Well, yes, thanks. Well, I will try to answer as best as I could, but I think if there anybody else, because we want this to be a conversation, if there's anyone else who can better address these questions, I look forward, because it's a learning experience for me too. I just want to mention, I think the first speaker, Raphael, mentioned that we are 23 million strong, and that is, I mean, it's larger than a lot of countries. But I just want to add, or I want to agree with him and add, if you throw in Cuba and Haiti, Dominican Republic, we are actually 43 million strong. I just putting that out there, all right? I just putting that for what it's worth. And when you really think of the whole Caribbean, not British Caribbean, but just the whole Cuba, Haiti, Dominican Republic, and so on, we are 43 million strong. So that's just to make your case even stronger, Comrade Andrews. Now, the issue of what is to be gained, what is to be lost, I think is a good or easy way to begin to communicate to people, because we talked about the mass movement, and therefore we have to somehow communicate the idea to the mass movement. And I think that's a simple way to do it. what is to be gained, what is to be lost. But I just want to say that it is hard to sell an idea of change when people are comfortable. However, I'm suggesting that the material conditions have changed and are changing now. With the aggressive push for neoliberalism in the Caribbean right now, where the ordinary working West Indian may have had some level of job security, for example, maybe 10 years ago, that is now gone. And therefore, the fallout of failed neoliberalism in the region will create the material conditions necessary to force people to rethink their existing political situation. Which is why when I was putting together this talk, I really want us to always, some things don't happen before their time. And when you say, well, what do you mean by time? Temporally and spatially, you're talking really about the material conditions of people. And I really believe that, and this is why I argue in my talk, that now, more than, let's say, 15 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago, you see, right now is an opportune time so that people realize that there is an alternative to their life conditions, which is becoming more and more miserable. More and more West Indians are becoming more and more indebted. And I'm talking about personal debt. Many are struggling to pay rent. Many are struggling to send their children to schools. Many are just struggling to eke out an existence. And I'm saying that the material conditions that preceded 1937, it wouldn't be exact, of course, it's relative, but that the level of inequality within the islands between the elites and ordinary West Indians, that gap is becoming wider and wider and wider. And therefore, I believe that in those material conditions, which are arising out of the failure of neoliberalism and the crisis of capitalism, I think is what will create the conditions for people to at least begin to explore alternative ideas. In terms of the inward collapse, I want to say, well, it's both, right? It's not and or, it's both. In that the external imperialist forces will exploit what they would have seen as cracks within the system. And one of the cracks that they saw, one of the things that they exploited was the emergence of the professional middle class. I want to suggest really that the collapse is really the result of class interests. The bourgeois class in the larger islands collaborated with the imperialism in order to break the federation. Persons may have a different view, but I do believe that class interests played. No, yes, there are the arguments that Adams, Manley, and Williams, they had their this ego, of course, there were squabbles over where the capital will be. There was things like the larger islands felt that they have to now incorporate the debt of the smaller islands. I'm saying, okay, yes, they were there, but I think those are the superficial things. Those were more symptomatic of a federation that the federation that came into being in 57, with all its, positive and I guess enthusiastic ideals, was really grounded in what would be a bourgeois or a professional middle class outlook. And that's contributed to its failure. And just to say on the question of the West Indian Development Fund, and I agree with Comrade Luke, yes, we have to be clear what the British really was talking about when they said they're going to put money into this fund. But a lot of that really had to do with financing the Arthur Lewis model of industrialization by invitation. it was to really, as I said, aggressively introduce industrial capitalism in the Caribbean. So of course, the British is a capitalist empire, right? So they would have wanted, when Orthodox presented this model, they latched onto that. And I'm suggesting that capitalism in itself is fundamentally and inherently flawed, and would therefore, and the crisis that comes with capitalism would further impoverish West Indians. And therefore, any project, economic project going forward, I have to say, some may argue that that's a bit idealistic, but I feel very strongly about that, that has to be beyond capitalism. Has to be. We will never survive or come out of this cycle of vulnerability so long as our economic model is nothing more than a continuation, or rather an extension of capitalism from the center. So I think that covered, I think there were the four questions. Comrade Luke, at least I hope that I tried, and
Yes,
other comrades can feel free to jump in.
that was very clear, Ozzy, and I think we've got to continually be pointing out and attacking the capitalist model, because I think from the whole environment standpoint now, it's becoming very clear that capitalism is based on a model of ongoing and continuous growth. We're living on a finite planet. We can't keep growing. It's going to destroy us in the end. So we have to find other models of going forward that doesn't mean we keep destroying the planet. Another issue that came up from one of the speakers there is about militarism in the region, and talking about the military bases. And we need to be reminded as well, one of the largest military bases in the world, the US bases in Colombia. And we see some big changes happening now with the possibility of a leftist government for the very first time in its history. And also with a Black woman, which is even more significant for these, who might well be the next Prime Minister of Colombia. She's been making great waves. A woman from humble beginnings who's risen to the top of the political ladder, as it were, in a country where racism is very deep, and where the Black people in Colombia have suffered a great deal of indignities and stealing of the land and resources and so on that has gone on. And so, yes, and also to already mention as well about the military in the region, the US clearly is looking to militarize the whole region if they can. And I think the CARICOM at some point has declared that the Caribbean region should be a zone of peace. And we need to remind our Caribbean leaders about that. And of course, Gabby pointed out the whole problem of those boots on the ground, those police boots. I'm sure, Ozzy, you will remember that tune very well. These police boots, they're marching.
Government boots, government boots.
Government boots, yes. We got too many of those boots in the region, and they're doing a great deal of damage too. With the whole idea of, that is very much so much in America that we see about defunding the police, that we need to be talking about it here in the UK as well as in the Caribbean. The police forces are still doing the job of the colonialists. They're mashing up the people continually, and so these are issues we need to look at. And I would just point out that Costa Rica, which is one of the countries that decided to disband the military, there's a happiness index, is one of the most happy countries in the world in terms of the happiness index. They have no military. So we don't need a military to make us feel secure and happy in our country. So these are issues to solve it. But let's see, there might be some more questions out there for you guys, or comments.
There's Marsha and Omar have both put their hands up.
Great. There we go, Marsha. You can need to unmute. Marsha. Marsha, you need to unmute. I wonder if she's hearing us. Doesn't look so. She's frozen.
I think Marsha's frozen. Perhaps after Omar and Olga Matthews has also put her hand up, so Marsha might have a better chance after those two.
Okay, try after Omar. We try again. Omar, you want to come in now? Unmute yourself.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to ask in terms of, I guess maybe it might be seen as kind of a nitpicking point, but it's also something that someone mentioned in the chat that I kind of ponder. And it's basically just to do with what's kind of the more preferable term to use with regards to federation. You know, would it be West Indian Federation or Caribbean Federation? Because obviously when I think on the term West Indian, I kind of think of the incorrect geographic terminology from Columbus's time, etc. So just to kind of get your thoughts on that really, and what's kind of most appropriate for us as a peoples, you know.
Yes.
All right. You want me to respond to that or take another one? Yeah, but that's a big one, Omar. Your question was short, but oh goodness.
Is Marsha ready now?
Yeah, I'm gonna try here and see if I can ask the question before my internet gets out again. I'm sorry, it's giving me a challenge. So the point that you made, Ozzy, about the co-option of the movement by the middle class is a significant one, and I think it is one that we have to understand as well. It is one of the major ones that remain in the way of federation, because the middle class has also become the political ruling class, the political ruling elite. And they now have a vested interest, more of a vested interest than their middle class interest, in making sure that they retain these 14 little empires that they run, you know, to the benefit of themselves and their families. So I also wanted to hear you expound on that a bit, coming off of the point that you made about the co-option of the movement by the middle class.
Okay. Let me start with Marsha's question before I get to Omar's very difficult question. Marsha, you're absolutely correct. You're absolutely correct. And that is going to be a challenge, and which is why you would have seen that my talk really focused on not trying to convince the ruling elites in any way whatsoever, or come up with some sort of, I don't know how to call it, intellectual arguments for the existing political elites. I really believe they're not going to shift, right? And my focus really is with the mass movement. How can we really instill, and as I mentioned, the material conditions that exist now, how can we plant this seed of first of all, of an alternative to the existing capitalist and neoliberal paradigm amongst the mass movement, because people are really feeling the negative impact of in their daily life based on the current system that they are existing in. And therefore, they must begin to believe that they can challenge that system, because that's what led to 37. Our foreparents believed that there was a problem with the system and that they needed to confront that system. And I'm suggesting that same spirit, that led to the 1937 rebellion, is what we require today. How we do it, how we build consciousness, how we educate, how do we use the platforms like social media to do so. All of that are technicalities that can, or programmatic things that we can work out, but it is absolutely crucial. We will never get federation under the current political elites. I'm totally agree with you there. Never happen. We will also, and the reason being is because don't forget, the political elites are the how to put it, are the political puppets of the economic elites, the bourgeoisie. Them ain't want no federation idea, or even if they did, they would like to see something that more resemble the European Union, I suppose, where their capital can expand more and more. All right. So we have to be conscious and, well, cognizant really of the bourgeois class that exists in our region, and how they have often in the past and continue to today collaborate with imperialist powers using the politicians who are now our professional middle class to keep the status quo, So I totally am with you there. Omar, that is a very difficult question, only in the sense that it touches the whole question of identity, isn't it? Who is a Caribbean person? Who's a West Indian? Oftentimes, when we hear West Indian, we conjure up ideas around British or Afro persons in the British colonies, right? But that is not what it is in reality. It's more than that. We have become a very multiracial, multicultural society. See, that's why CLR was correct when he said that it's two things he said. It's exciting and it's unique. He said it's unusual, rather, is the word he used, unusual. And that is true. But I think it is in that, because we are this sort of new social category in history, that is what makes us really pioneers and could be the vanguard of what can be considered a global transformation. All right. We've played that role before in terms of like the rise of the Pan-African movement, like with people like George Padmore and so on. And I think therefore we can play that role again, but we must recognize the multiracial, multicultural aspect of who we are. So a person from Dominican Republic consider themselves Caribbean, may not be West Indian, but definitely Caribbean. They do distinguish themselves from Spanish speakers on the mainland, all right? So to Cubans and even Puerto Ricans, right? Definitely our French sisters and brothers in Martinique and Guadeloupe definitely see themselves completely different to mainland France and see themselves as Caribbean people. So I think that's why I use the term interchangeably only for it to be a sort of, for us to see or think of, when we say West Indian, we don't mean only the West Indies cricket team or the West Indies, University of the West Indies. I do not want us to confine ourselves only to former British colonies, but to expand our understanding of our identity to include this, to include French speakers, Spanish, Dutch, Papiamento, etc. That's why I said it's part of our work in progress.
Yes. Yes,
And we
agree.
should not be afraid, and we shouldn't be afraid to say it's work in progress, and shouldn't try to, because it's people will try, there will be those who will try to confine us and say, well, no, you had to pick a definition. Why? Why should I pick a definition? My mother is Vincentian, right? And my great-grandfather is Venezuelan.
Yeah, I guess Ozzy, is one of the questions that really is up for discussion as we start to think about this new federation, whether it's Caribbean Federation, and of course, we in Caribbean, there was solidarity. We've always looked at the region in a bigger way. We include Venezuela, Colombia, all the regions around in the Caribbean basin, as it were. And clearly, we need to come up with a name that might be completely different from West Indian Federation.
Agree.
As we start to progress this discussion as we go,
Sure.
Especially with the negative connotations that goes with West Indian. Yeah. Okay. So thanks for your question there, too, Mark. Is there any more there?
Olga Matthews has put her hand up.
Hi, Olga. Come in. Unmute. Is Olga out there?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Oh, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
with my.
You keep on muting.
Yeah, I can't keep it.
That's good now. Oh, it's gone again.
Oh, this is so frustrating.
This is better
Frustrating.
now. This is okay now. Yes. Oops.
Okay. Oh, no. I might have to give up. Yeah. I'll have another go, and if it stops again, I'll just try and put it in the chat. I think to an extent my concern's been addressed in the last response that Ozzi gave, but and I don't, I'm no spring chicken, so I'm kind of wondering whether this is just an observation from my perspective, or whether it's actually the case. And it's about life here, having come from the Caribbean, life here, and having originated from parents who were born in Guyana. I sense that as we've moved away from that generation of people, I've lost both my parents now, we've become less and less people who have a sense of being part of the Caribbean or the West Indies, whichever you choose. And I think we've become more kind of factionated along island, for want of a better word, island lines. So I feel I'll often go to events where I want to talk about the Caribbean experience, and people fall into speaking about specific island experiences, and they define themselves while living in Britain as being from that particular space. And I think how we behave here is important as part of as diaspora. How we behave as diasporic peoples is really important. And I'm not sure whether we will have the same understandings of what is needed in the Caribbean, or even necessarily the same understandings of what reparation is about. And that might be a question more for Luke, possibly, than Ozzi. I don't know.
Yes.
Thank you. Can I say Francis King's also got his hand up?
Okay, come in, Francis.
Oh, you can hear me, yeah? It's a, it's a question for Ozzi. It's about the experience of the last 50, 60, 70 or so years since the islands started becoming independent one after the other. Because back in the days of British colonialism, you know, one thing that the British colonial authorities did provide was a common enemy. So you could unite against them, at least. Now that is kind of altogether more diffuse, and the islands have been developing on their own trajectories for several decades. Do you feel that your aim of federation is becoming more distant, more difficult, or are economic or whatever developments sort of making the commonalities more and more important? You know, what's the trajectory? Which way has it been going since 57, 62?
Yeah, well,
okay,
that's
Ozzi, before you do, maybe I'll just reply to Olga's a question about Caribbean and people organizing separately in the diaspora. I think we in the diaspora have a really significant and important part to play in advancing the case for federation. And from your question, it's clearly given me an idea that we maybe need to hold a conference even in the UK on that, where we've got so many people from the different islands and countries in the region that can come to such a discussion that we can air these difficulties and problems. But Caribbean Labor Solidarity, we've always tried to organize, and at the beginning when there was left organizations in the region, we had members from those organizations who were in the diaspora would meet with us. We had a really vibrant community of, people, whether it's from Jamaica, St. Vincent, Grenada, Guyana, Trinidad, we all came together to discuss the issues that were relevant for the region. And with the lockdown and so on, we haven't had any public meetings in the UK for some time, but we are thinking about it. And federation might be a good place to start a discussion in the UK again. Yes, thanks for your question, Olga. Great. Okay, Ozzi, you can go with that.
Yes.
Thanks.
All right. Thanks for Comrade Francis, for your question. Just to say, though, the role of the diaspora is so important. When we think about a lot of the movements within the region, a lot of it has been linked to the diaspora. And I think a reconnecting, though I think that there is some connection, but a reconnection that is deeper and stronger is necessary. Okay. And I think that, and especially for those of us on the left, because we know the attacks on the left, on the Caribbean left in particular, and I'm talking about now in the Caribbean itself, has been it was quite aggressive. And I do believe that the diaspora now, especially those on the left, reconnecting in a very strong way with those of us here who are trying still to fulfill that dream of true freedom, but freedom from exploitation, freedom from imperialism and capitalism. So I just want to say that that the role of the diaspora is absolutely crucial. It played a role before, and therefore it will have to play a role now. Now, when I think of Comrade King's question of the common enemy, and I agree with that, but I also want us to think about Grenada between 1979 and 1983. The ruling elites would, and definitely the bourgeois class, would love for us to forget Grenada and forget that that very important moment in Caribbean history, the Grenadine Revolution. In fact, I remember some years ago, and it really struck me, and it has been with me ever since. Really, the co-opting and the taking over of the political and economic life of West Indians, Caribbean people, by the professional middle class for and on behalf of the bourgeois class is really something else, you know. I will never ever forget this. I went to Grenada for, it was a meeting, one of those UN meetings, so you know, middle class kind of type thing. And so they were doing a presentation on the history of Grenada to the delegates. So I was listening, and of course they had children. So it was a presentation of the history of Grenada by young people, right? Would have been between the ages of, I would say, 12 to 15 years old. Now this was quite a bit of, this would have been about 15 years ago, right? So I'm watching to see, well, all right, okay, so they start off with the indigenous population, all right, the coming of the Europeans. That did not describe it as a conquest, but okay, all right. All right, so I'm watching on, and then they talk about Eric Gary, I think, Gary. So I'm watching on now with great anticipation to see how they're going to portray the Grenadine Revolution. To my shock and horror, they portrayed it as a small hiccup in Grenada's history. And that struck me, and I'll never forget it. Because you see, that Grenada Revolution gave the Caribbean an opportunity to see what was possible, even in a post-independence situation. And the ruling elites of the region, and definitely it were the ruling elites in Grenada at that time. I'm not saying that it's the same now. I haven't been to Grenada in a while, but definitely at that time, 15 years ago or so, they sought to rub out that history completely. And it led me to believe that that is, I think, when we talk about West Indian Federation now, and we talk about alternatives, we must put the Grenadine Revolution back on the table. We must put it back on the table to analyze, not, of course, to deeply analyze its failures, but not its failure, but it's the eventual invasion by the US, but to really analyze what would have been its achievements. What was being attempted, how it was being attempted, how did it involve women, how did it involve restructuring different things, I think I believe that we should look at it. And therefore, I agree that whilst it is difficult now because you don't have a common enemy, I want to go back to my belief that the material conditions are going to force people to find a common enemy and find that common enemy in the bourgeois class of their respective countries and see that class as attempting to extract from them more and more surplus value and more than that, dispossess them of their material things, whether it's house, a decent job, and so on, but also dispossess them of their dignity. I think when that starts to resonate within the Caribbean, I believe that offers an opportunity. But we have to be ready to take that opportunity because you know what can happen? You can have right-wing extremism also emerging in the region if we are not careful. Do not for 1 minute think that it's only in advanced developed capitalist countries. No. No. We have to be careful. And that's why the left have to regain their, how to put it, put back, for those who may have laid it down for a little bit, good their ammo again, put back on their war boots, and let us use this current period of capitalist crisis and the failure of neoliberalism to offer an alternative to our people. Also, sorry, can I just quickly, I want to say also, let me also talk about the geopolitical context, as I mentioned that. The geopolitical context today is very different to 20 years ago. 20 years ago, US imperialism completely dominated the Latin American geopolitical landscape and Latin America and the Caribbean. But now people are also seeing a possibility of alternatives. And we've seen a real shift or a battle, really, ideological battle playing itself out on the geopolitical landscape of Latin America and the Caribbean. And yes, the imperialist powers are using every means possible to subjugate Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia. We saw the coup in Venezuela, the constitutional coup in Brazil, the one in Honduras. So these are real things that are happening now, not in the past, but it's happening right before our eyes. And even as you saw the rise of the left, you saw the aggressive backlash by the right. There was a bit of retreat, but then you see the left coming back again. It means that there's a real resilience to find an alternative to capitalism and neoliberalism.
Great. Thank you, Ozzy. I think we're approaching it, the hour. That sounded almost like a concluding remark, a call to arms. We take that very seriously, and I hope that some of our listeners and people who have attended they'll do that. So I will end our conversation here, as it were, and hand back to Omar, who will be chairing this session, really. And so he can start to wrap up. We're scheduled to finish at 4, so I don't know if there's anything else. Omar, I'll hand over to you. Thank you, Ozzy.
Thank you very much.
Thank
you all for having me. I really appreciate, the opportunity to just share with fellow comrades from across the Atlantic. We are all, regardless of spatial and differences, you across on the other side of the Atlantic. I send you all solidarity. I send you whatever sunshine we have. I send you your love, and let us keep fighting together.
Ozzy, thank you very, very much for speaking for us this afternoon. We really appreciate it, or this morning, based on other time zones. We really, really appreciate it. It's been an exceptionally insightful talk. And thank you very much for answering my very complicated, multi-layered question. I appreciate the detailed answer that was given. Just as a reminder before we close off, we ourselves, CLS, will be present on Wednesday outside of the Rwanda High Commission for the protest against the unjust deal that's been struck between the Rwandese government and the British government, between the Home Office, to unjustly take those who are fleeing very dangerous situations often caused by military-industrial complex from the UK and other countries. So please join us there on Wednesday. The details have been punched into the chat, and we'll probably send an email out in advance of that, or do follow us on Twitter. Thank you very much for everybody who's tuned in today. I think that's all of our notifications. Join in later on also, if you have the time, for Marsha's talk, which will be happening at 12 a.m. UK time, 7 p.m. Barbados time. We'll also drop that on social media again. But thank you to Ozzi again, and thank you to everyone who's joined us here today.
Thank you so much. Okay.
Bye, all.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you, guys.
Okay, Ozzy.
Thanks very much, Ozzy. Thanks very much, Ozzy. That was very good. Much appreciated. Yeah, lots to think about, and we need to keep in touch to make sure that we push this project forward.
Yes, agree.
Definitely. Much so.
Forward ever, backward never.
Yes.
All right, everyone. I'm going to leave early. I've actually got somebody waiting to collect me. So
okay,
I should say bye now. I won't stay for the meeting to the end, but you guys can meet.
Yeah,
if
we
you
can
want
wrap
to.
up.
I guess you'll fix a date for the next executive meeting and so on. So,
yeah.
All right.
Okay, so we'll say goodbye to everybody, and I'll close it down now. And thanks everyone for coming and contributing, and see you next time.